those who know a little bit about the history of Ronald Reagan, yeah, they'll know that he became the president in 1980. However, not many people know that his win in 1980 was actually the third time he had tried to become president. And the first time was in 1968, the second time was in 1976, and obviously the third time was in 1980. So, you know, as the old saying goes, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And that's certainly what Ronald Reagan did. So in 1968, Ronald Reagan was up against Richard Nixon, who had been the vice president in 1960 and who had run and lost against JFK, which we've done a video on, so definitely give that a watch because, you know, that's very good and there's a lot of overlap between this video and that, so for some of the finer details you'll need to watch that. But in the Republican Convention of 1968, Ronald Reagan actually got a majority of votes. That sounds a bit strange. How can you get a majority of votes and still lose? Well, the reason for that is that the convention system for picking who's going to be the candidate for each party in election time, it wasn't as entrenched as it is now. And so, you know, the process was a little bit murky and stuff, right? So as a result, even though he got a majority of votes, in actual fact, Richard Nixon ended up winning. Now, the reason for this was basically because outside of the state of California, where Ronald Reagan had recently become governor, he didn't do very well amongst the other states. Yeah, like Richard Nixon beat him by like 60% plus in a lot of the states. And the only reason why he ended up even winning in California was because his name was the only name that appeared on the ballot. So, you know, the vast majority of the votes that he had was as a result of winning the state of California, but he ended up dropping out the race because, you know, he didn't get the right number of delegates. So yeah, but either way, it was a way of him kind of testing the waters, so to speak, and to see just how popular like he was like within his party and like within the country as a whole. Because up until this point, Ronald Reagan hadn't really been known on the public stage for being a politician. As a matter of fact, you know, like, so a little quick brief rundown of his history. So he was born in a small town in Illinois to a relatively poor family, and his father was you know, he was a drunken. So he had a relatively difficult childhood. But when he was a child, he always envisioned, you know, like helping people and stuff, right? And this is why he took a job as being a lifeguard. And then when he got older, he then decided to, you know, go into the world of acting, and this is when he ended up becoming a Hollywood star. Not a major star, but like, you know, he definitely rubbed shoulders with like all the current actors at that time, and he was a very close friend of John Wayne, who was obviously really big at the time as well. And him and John Wayne eventually end up like sharing a lot of the same values. This wasn't the case when he first went out there, because when he first went out there, he was a New Deal Democrat. So he was a very liberal, like kind of like very like progressive Democrat. Thomas Sowell, the economist, famously joked once that Ronald Reagan was so far to the left that the CIA had files on him during the McCarthy era. And actually, what's interesting is that Ronald Reagan, to this day, is the first president, and so far the only president, who is not only a member of a trade union, but was actually the leader of a trade union. And this is in the Screen Actors Guild. So while his acting career didn't really take off, like, you know, he was in a few minor films and he was in a few like TV shows and stuff, he used that time to basically kind of build his kind of political credentials and stuff within that trade union. And then he then ended up taking a job in General Electric, and, you know, he would go about as a spokesman for them, so to go to all the different plants around the country and speaking to people there, like, you know, giving talks and stuff. He'd talk to them about government and talk to them about taxes and regulations and everything, right? And yeah, so over time, his views began to change. He went from being an avid supporter of people like FDR and like Harry Truman and stuff, and bit by bit he ended up becoming a conservative Republican. And this was compounded when he ended up meeting his second wife, Nancy Reagan. And also something to note is that Ronald Reagan was the first president who had been a divorcee. So, you know, up until that point, there had been a bit of a stigma about it, but he was the first one who kind of broke that stigma as such. But Ronald Reagan really burst onto the political scene in 1964. And this is when he gave his famous speech, which, you know, Reaganites even today will refer to as being the speech. And people more commonly like refer to it as a time for choosing. This is a speech in which he campaigned for Barry Goldwater for the presidency in 1964. And in this speech that he basically outlined all of his beliefs and why people ought to vote for the Republican Party, you know. So he spoke about like the Cold War and how America was in retreat and how they were basically fighting a kind of not just a military war, not just economic war, but also a spiritual war against the Soviet Union, which he would later refer to as being the evil empire. And he also spoke in that about the growing size of the federal government and about the welfare state. He basically said the reason why he left the Democratic Party was, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And this kind of represents the leftward shift that the Democratic Party took in the 1950s and 60s away from kind of more traditional small government values. And this was mainly the reason why he ended up becoming a Republican in the first place, because he could see people like JFK and LBJ pushing for programs like what ended up becoming the Great Society. And he really railed against the welfare state, and especially as he called them, welfare bums. And he famously said that he was in favour of sending the welfare bums back to work. So he's just, he didn't mince his words basically when he was saying things. And it was soon after this that he ended up becoming the governor for California. And actually he ended up building quite a reputation for himself as being someone who is vehemently against the peace movement, being vehemently against the hippie movement in general, and against the left libertarian values of the 60s era. Now, people who know about Ronald Reagan as the president, he's always a kind of smiling, warm-hearted kind of guy, always making jokes and stuff. And actually, I've got a Reagan joke. Well, Reagan-style joke for you in a little bit, but just wait. But this was a very different Reagan from the one who became governor in 1966, because his rhetoric and how he ran his state was in a very kind of harsh way. Famously there was the Berkeley protest, which was at the University of Berkeley, in which there was a bunch of peace protesters there, and these protesters, started to riot, started to burn down bits of the campus. And so as a result, he sent in the state National Guard. He sent in 2,200 of them, and many people in the kind of hippie movement expected public opinion to, see it as an overreaction and to take their side. But what a lot of people who look at the 60s don't really recognise is that the peace movement, the hippie movement, all the kind of musicians and the general culture that we think of was limited to a very tiny subset of the youth population, and that the vast majority of people were, as Richard Nixon would famously say, the great silent majority. And these people were traditional, these people were patriotic, they were pro the war, and they were opposed to the kind of liberal values that were espoused in this time. So as a result, these protesters really underestimated Reagan's support, and they soon learned that public opinion was definitely not on their side, but was on the side of Ronald Reagan. Now, first of all, we're going to start this video by talking about the Vietnam War. So, the Vietnam War in 1968, you had the famous Tet Offensive, and in the eyes of many people, this is when the Vietnam War was lost for America. But this isn't necessarily true. So, in terms of public opinion, because the American public had been told for many, many years that they were on the verge of winning that war, people were very surprised when the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong end up pulling off this crazy offensive. But in reality, it was a complete defeat for the NVA and the VC, because in reality, they just didn't have any more capability. They'd taken a huge risk and had thrown everything into defeating the Americans and kicking out the South Vietnamese government, and they'd still lost. So they didn't have any more resources to kind of fight this kind of war at this scale. And actually later reports from the Vietnamese government has now been released, and they've actually confirmed that had the war continued as it had after that point, kind of in the same level of American involvement, the same level of ferocity against them, that eventually they would have had to sue for peace, because they just simply didn't have the capacity to keep this war going. However, in the eyes of the American public, this war was an unwinnable war, and so this kind of started Vietnamization, which was just a code word basically for the Americans pulling out. The number of troops end up steadily declining, and America poured loads and loads of money and resources and weapons and stuff into the South Vietnamese government, and then they end up eventually losing, because the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in the next 7 years were able to regroup, they were able to rebuild, and as a result they were then able to, when the Americans left in 73, 2 years after that, they end up seizing Saigon, and North and South Vietnam was united under a communist government. So the Vietnam War ended up being lost. But if Reagan had been president, would this necessarily have happened? Well, Reagan said in an interview many years later that he wasn't in favour of the war at the beginning, but once America was in, the war should be won. And so he would have put everything into America winning that war. You know, he might have kept the war going and even escalated and, you know, increased the troop numbers and stuff, in spite of what many people in the public were kind of protesting about. And I think that, you know, he would have really pushed hard on it. So for instance, in 1970, when the Nixon administration invaded Cambodia, but then ended up retreating as a result of public opinion kind of being against it, I think that Ronald Reagan still would have pushed ahead with this. And as we discussed in that previous video about JFK and Nixon, you know, the Viet Cong end up going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was in Laos and Cambodia. And so I think that if they'd been able to take Cambodia, then that would have seriously dented the number of supplies and men who could get through that Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so as a result, the war in the south would have been a lot less intense, and it would have been a lot easier to have held down that territory. However, something to note is that Ronald Reagan's rhetoric was much more intense than there had been for any other president up until that point. So I think that the Cold War, which in our own timeline was, you know, they were pushing towards détente, which is relaxation of tensions. I think that Reagan would have gone the exact opposite direction. You know, like in his famous speech, Time for Choosing, he talks about how we cannot abide our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion people now trapped behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom. Because in order to save our own skins, we're willing to do a deal with your slave masters. So he was not in favour of détente. The fact that there were billions of people in, you know, like Red China and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who were, you know, living behind the Iron Curtain, living in communist countries, you know, I don't think he would have wanted détente with them. You know, I think that he, just as he did when he was president in the 1980s, I think that he would have pushed for America to win the Cold War, not just to keep it going, not just to, you know, have a balance of power. He wanted communism to end up collapsing. He wanted America to win the Cold War. And so in our own timeline, this ended up essentially happening with the Soviet Union collapsing and stuff. But I think that he would have upped the pressure. And I think that in this period here, rather than having détente, you'd have had much tenser relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union.